interest is in the field of inclusive education, quality assurance education, and internalization of education. He is an active member of the Eastern African Research and Innovation Management Association, the African Network of Internalization of Education. Dr. Simon today is going to speak about something blocks to e-learning, analyzing universities, policies, students with print disabilities. Let me at the same time introduce our discussant for today, Dr. Oliver Mutanga. Dr. Oliver Mutanga is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Nazarbayev University, Kazakhstan. He has over a decade of experience in advancing the understanding of challenges faced by individuals with disabilities, particularly in the Global South. His research centers on developing and implementing innovative solutions to enhance accessibility, inclusion, and quality of life for people with disabilities. He has published books and numerous peer-reviewed articles, and has been invited to present his findings at conferences worldwide. Without wasting much of the time, over to you, Dr. Simon. The moment is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. Yeah. This study was motivated by the fact that for the past 4 decades, higher education landscape in Africa has gone through the various changes. And one of the changes that most of the universities now, they adapt the online or e-learning mode towards offering their degree or study program. So this study specifically was looking on the barriers or stumbling blocks to e-learning, focusing on universities, policies, and both practices to a section of population of the students who have got print disabilities, who tend to be ignored by most of the policies and practices in university. So to start with introduction, that over the past 3 decades, higher education across Africa has undergone significant changes. And some of the changes that there's high increase of access to higher education has expanded at a rapid rate and an unprecedented rate, including increased number of students with disabilities, different disabilities, including the print disabilities. Most of the universities across the continent, they add most of them, they are offering the traditional, they're using the traditional or campus-based learning mode, where students are supposed to come on campus and pursue their studies. This is called physical traditional. But also, those universities, most of the universities, they offer also the blended learning mode, where these traditional students on campus, they are allowed to also to do the blended learning mode while they are attending their traditional university education on campus. Also, some universities, they have established the distance learning mode or pure online learning mode, including UNISA, also in Tanzania, Open University of Tanzania, where they normally offer all the degrees using the pure online learning mode, unlike other traditional universities, which we are supposed to be their students are supposed to be there on campus. So such increase of students in terms of enrollment have subsequently led to an urgent need for universities across the continent to create supporting services to students, both physical, especially for those who are in the traditional campus-based, and also online supporting services to those students, including students with disabilities. And for this study, focuses on students with print disabilities. So you can see that there's an increase of enrollment in sub-Saharan region. You can see there that at least there's when you see the trend from 1990 to 2018, there's an increase of students enrolled in universities. But when you compare with other regions of the world, seems like the sub-Saharan Africa is not doing well. But at least within the region, we've seen some increase of enrollment of students in higher education, especially universities. Again, we're looking at the percentage of tertiary students out of total enrolled. Here, there's a variation between those students who have been enrolled and those students who graduate. Some of them, they drop out due to various reasons. And so we can see the variation between the enrolled students as well as the graduation rate for students across the continent. And you can see that, I don't think you can see that, but at least you can see that there's a variation between one country and the other. For example, South Sudan, they have a low number of graduate students, and when compared to other countries, the region. However, exact number of students with disabilities enrolled in universities is not clearly known across the sub-Saharan Africa. So what is print disability? Print disability is a person who cannot effectively access traditional print materials because of a visual, physical, or severe learning disabilities that affects reading. Actually, this one is that we found that most of the students sometimes they don't know whether they are facing this disability, because when you look up in the sample, you see them like, okay, they're okay. But when come, for example, when they're sitting for the exam, it's when they're facing this problem. So print disability is that those students actually they can on the naked eye you can see that they're okay, but in actual sense they are facing difficulties when it comes to accessing the traditional print materials. So literature suggests that these students with print disabilities in university, they are facing different barriers or challenges. For example, Timan and Mulville, they say that these students are facing social and cultural stigmatization, prejudice, and less consideration from their communities as well as peers, classrooms, or and halls of residence. Also, Kaunda and Chizwina also say that most of the facilities available on campus are not designed to provide equal access to students with print disability. Again, Kane and Francois argue that policies in place guiding universities as well as pedagogical arrangement take a little consideration to students with print disabilities. Therefore, little is known on how university policies are geared towards supporting students with print disabilities, especially in Tanzanian universities amidst the 29 years after 1994 Salamanca Conference on Special Needs Education, which was emphasizing on the inclusion of all learners in education institutions. Also, the Marrakesh Treaty, which emphasized on accessible format of print materials for those students or for persons with print disabilities. So these are two international instruments, our conventions, on which this study look at on the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action, as well as Marrakesh Treaty, on which Tanzania acceded that treaty and entered into force on 8th of July 2020 to facilitate the access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise disabled. Legal instruments in Tanzania with regard to the student, persons with disabilities. We have 1977 Constitution of the United Republic of Tanzania, where in clause 12, which is the equality clause, it emphasizes that when any person who has got a disability, when unfairly discriminated against on the basis of their condition, that person with disabilities should be able to rely on the Constitution to get remedies before the court of law. However, these rights stipulated in the constitutions do not translate into daily lives of students with disabilities at universities, even in different education levels. So also, specifically, there's legislation, the Person with Disability Act 2010. On this particular act, section 28, it stipulates that it is unlawful for any or an education authority or institution to develop a curriculum or training courses having a content that will either exclude the person from the participation or subject the person to any judgment. So this is stipulated in the specific, specific legislation in Tanzania. So this study wanted to look on how do students with disabilities, universities, policies, how do they accommodate student disabilities during the COVID-19 and after COVID-19. We are all aware that during the COVID-19 in around March 2020, throughout 2021 and 2022, the world experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, and most of the universities abruptly closed their campuses, and some of them they embark on online learning mode. However, in that particular abrupt change of from the traditional way of teaching to online learning mode, there are some section of students who were discriminated or were left behind during that particular period. For example, in some of the universities we conducted study, actually we had 6 universities in Tanzania. They went to embark on the online learning mode. We found that there are several barriers these students with disabilities they are facing. So conceptual framework of this study, we adopted the non-FRASER participatory approach, PARITY, which entirely stipulate on the 3 key dimensions. One is distribution or equal distribution of resources. The second one is recognition of opinions and interests are recognized. And the third one is representation of power of those involved in the institution. The methodology, data from universities. This study actually was conducted in 6 universities in Tanzania. And 6 universities include 3 private universities and 3 public universities. And some of them, for example, one of the university, Open University of Tanzania, for them they are different because they are offering all their study programs through the online learning mode even before the COVID-19. So that was from basic disability or special education needs officials, students with print disabilities, academic staff, and librarians. Also, various university policies documents were reviewed. Survey data was also, survey was also used to collect data from students, interview with the academic staff and the librarians. Also, 2 methods were used to identify and select study participants. One is snowball technique to identify and select students with print disability. And also students were supposed to nominate academic staff who teach them at universities. So students were contracted and then they nominate academic staff who are teaching them. So generally, this study involved 50 students with disabilities from 6 universities in Tanzania, 10 academic staff, and 5 librarians. Results. So these are some of the barriers students with printing disabilities. They mentioned that these are barriers was engaging in e-learning. So some of these barriers is lack of specialist lecturers. They are saying that, okay, most of these lecturers who are teaching us, they don't have knowledge on how they can handle us. They can handle students with special needs. So 9 of them, they said that most of the lecturers, they tend to lack that particular knowledge, and lack of writing materials, especially those who are they're using Braille, and handouts are given in print format. Most of the handouts, for example, both outline materials given in print format, which do not consider the various needs of these students with print disabilities. Also, they mentioned about socialization, especially from peers as well as lecturers. They are not supportive enough towards their schooling at university. In accessibility to lecture theaters, library and facilities, textbook references, most of them they are in print form. Actually, they don't consider their various needs as well. Deprived attention, non-cooperative staff, as well as they feel isolated from their peers. So this study, as I said before, that this study is all about looking on the universities' policies as well as practices when it comes to students with print disabilities. Out of 6 universities selected, now these 6 universities have specific policies on handling students not only with print disability, but any disability. 6 of the universities, they don't have any policy in place how to handle students with print disabilities and their needs. But in practice, we found that most of the library and the book catalog or materials, they are still in print form. They're still in print form, which make them harder for students with print disability to access them, especially on the catalog. Also, interviewing with academic staff, lecturers who are teaching disabilities, they indicate that in case of students with print disabilities, they admitted that we don't not know what to do because our subjects involve drawings projected on the screen. I tried to contact special education units and they say they cannot help. So I asked myself, what can I do with these students? That means that most of these, especially for those practical oriented or like geography, college where they involve a lot of drawings, and most of these students, they tend to not access they cannot even see the drawings projected on the screen. Also, another finding that most of the students, especially students with print disabilities, they tend to report issues very late. Problem is severe among first-year students. When they report, they don't know where they're supposed to report. When you compare to continuing students, majority are unaware of the services offered by the special education units in their respective universities. So they reported that they don't know where to report them. So they end up reporting very late. And another finding is that the causes reference list, they are submitted very late. Actually, lecturers, academic staff, they submit very late the reference list to the special education units because we found that most of them, for example, the semester when it started, most of them they are not ready to submit. So it takes them some time for them to submit. And then when they submit very late, that has got implication those students with print disabilities. They don't get the materials on time from the particular lecturers. So this study recommends the following: that universities, to avoid those particular barriers, universities need to work directly with publishers to ensure that publishers they supply accessible textbooks with appropriate format which will accommodate students with print disabilities. Also, adequate funds should be available to procure assistive technologies available in the market to ensure that the students with print disabilities are accommodated in their schooling at universities. And finally, is the training of staff, both academic staff as well as non-academic staff, on how they can accommodate students with special needs. That is one of the major problems. Actually, we found that in the particular study that most of the teachers, academic staff as well as non-academic staff, including librarians, they don't have that knowledge on how they can handle students with disabilities. So to conclude, that students with disabilities, despite having the challenges they're facing during their schooling, they continue to survive in an equal learning environment, whereby their colleagues who are non-disabled, they are getting they're treated well, they are getting the references, they are getting treatment in the sense that they are getting the materials on which they can read. They're given enough time to finish the exam. But these students with print disabilities, they are facing that difficulties, and it seems like no one or the policy itself, no, it's not decided. Actually, there's no policy in place to guide the practice, as well as the practice itself is just like an informal, non-formal arrangement between the lecturer and the students, and even the disability unit is not well equipped to at least to attend each and everyone particular needs, especially when it comes to special needs from students with disabilities. Also, this study suggests that suggests remedial intervention that universities should, could pursue collectively to improve educational opportunities of students with disabilities. Availability of modern technology facilities available where universities they can procure and make sure that these students with disabilities are not affected. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngalomba. Over to you, Dr. Mutanga, to respond to the question.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, Simon, for this presentation. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I think Simon examines an important and timely topic related to the accessibility of online learning for students with print disabilities in Tanzania. And understanding these experiences for these students is very important because it is vital for fostering inclusive education. It is also vital for driving technological advancement or technological adaptations. It is also important for promoting social inclusion or social equity. These efforts continue to be very important as they contribute to more equitable and diverse higher education systems that benefits all students. So it's very important and timely discussion. Thank you, Simon. So I'm going to just touch on a few issues regarding the presentation as well as the paper that was forwarded to me. So my first discussion will be focused on the context. I think, Simon, you could have provided more context on the Tanzanian higher education system and the specific challenges that students with print disabilities face. And additionally, you could have provided the state of online learning in Tanzanian universities, including the challenges that are faced by students, both pre-COVID and post-COVID. You could also have touched on issues like connectivity in Tanzania in terms of internet, affordability of internet, it would also be helpful to discuss the specific features of online learning platforms that are used in Tanzania. Again, you could have also discussed how Tanzanian universities have incorporated other international practices and guidelines like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines or Universal Design for Learning in their practices. This would then allow for a broader discussion of how Tanzanian universities can learn from the global experiences to improve accessibility and inclusivity in their online learning policies and practices. Then I'll move on to policy analysis. I think you did well in exploring the roles of municipal and international law in shaping university policies and practices related to online learning and accessibility in Tanzania. But you could also take it further, to discuss how municipal laws, that is the laws within a country, Tanzania, relate to these international laws like the conventions on the rights of persons with disabilities and the Salamanca statement, and see how this connects. Then you looked at 6 universities and you wanted to look at their policies. You rightly say that I think all of these universities, they don't have disability policies. But you don't have to look at disability policies only when you are looking at inclusion of students with print disabilities. Go also and look at the admission policies, the assessment policies, accommodation policies at universities, and these might inform your studies actually better and in more depth. Then also when you're analyzing policies, there are many frameworks that are used to analyze policies. We have, for example, multi-criteria analysis, which assesses and compares accessibility, in your case, inclusivity, quality of support, and then policy implementation. So you then identify and weigh key factors that are important for the effectiveness of these policies. Then you can rank the universities, these 6 universities, and highlight areas of improvement. You could also use the logical framework analysis, where you employ the structure, the objectives, and the outcomes of each university's different policies that I have highlighted as they relate to students with print disabilities. And by examining their inputs, their activities, their outputs, their outcomes, and their impacts, you can then identify the strengths and weaknesses of each policy, and then you develop your recommendations from there. There are many other policy frameworks that you can use, but I just want to give you these 2. Then we move on to your conceptual framework, which is Nancy Fraser's participatory parity. I think it's, as it is, the way you have presented to us, it lacks clarity on how you are using Nancy Fraser. You did not consistently and clearly apply the concept throughout your analysis. This makes it difficult for us then to understand how the concept contributes to the overall argument that you are trying to put. So incorporating the concept of participatory parity more clearly would provide a stronger theoretical basis for your analysis and help us to conceptualize the issues faced by these students with print disabilities. For instance, you could have examined how policies or practices are related to online, either promote or hinder the participatory parity of these students. Then on your recommendations, again, you would then go back again to the 3 dimensions of social justice that you highlighted: representation, recognition, and redistribution, to inform your recommendations. Lastly, methodological issues. I think your arguments are based on interviews, survey data, and policy analysis. But when you are then describing your findings, it does not provide sufficient details of where you got what and how you then analyzed your data. It's missing. And this lack of transparency then might raise questions on the genuineness of your findings. So I think you, as I have seen your paper, I think you're still developing the paper. These are some of the issues that you might look at, but overall, thank you for presenting this paper, and thank you for embarking on such a important research. And yeah, I think that will be all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mutanga, for responding. But to you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Mutanga, for your input. Yes, it's true that this is work in progress. I'm still working on this paper, so some of the things you mentioned are going to be corrected my final version as level of difficulty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. As you say, the paper is still in development, so there's room and space to take it further. So I've got a couple of questions which are really just for clarity and one or two others. So I was curious as to why you selected print disability as the focus. Is it because it's more prevalent? I mean, you could have selected other things to look at. And I wondered if in the way that you are understanding it, if you include dyslexia in terms of being able to deal with print. So I wasn't sure. So that's just a question. I was interested in how the 6 universities were selected. Is it that they are, case studies of good practice in supporting disabled students? Was it just pragmatic access and so on? Oliver clarified that your data includes interview survey and policy analysis. I wasn't sure. And I wondered who else was involved in the research. So 6 universities, did you have co-researchers who were involved as well? So those were the more clarification questions. And then I want to echo what Oliver has said about the use of FRASER's framework. So, I mean, it's not about whether or not to use FRASER, it's really how you use it, because it wasn't clear to me what this was adding conceptually to your data, these dimensions of recognition, distribution, and representation. But I also wondered if it's work in progress, whether you might not want to think how, if the human developmental capability lens might also add to the study and move it on conceptually. What was missing for me in the presentation, I haven't seen the paper, was student voice data. I think if you want to tell the story, or if you want to tell stories about students with disabilities at universities, we really need to hear the voices of the students and what their experiences are. And I think this came through very strongly in Oliver's own thesis, and then also in Darker's thesis and the data. So for me, that was really missing. If you want to get at FRASER's recognitional dimension around dignity and valuing and so on, I don't know how you do that without looking very carefully at student voice, what students are saying. And then with regard to the e-learning platform, I was wondering about the pedagogies that were employed. So, so there's a technical or what's the word, mechanical, I'm not sure what it is, about whether or not you can read the text. But what kind of pedagogies are scaffolding learning for all students? I mean, good pedagogy and inclusive pedagogy would, by its nature, also be inclusive of students with disabilities. And then it would be, well, how do you know what kind of pedagogies were being employed in terms of the questions you might have asked of them? So I think there's some quite interesting ways.
Then I would like to respond to and thanks for one more sentence.
With regard to why I decided to take the disability, is that okay, from the experience, because I've been teaching these students with disability, that most of the focus is on students with physical disability and this student with print disability. So the problem is there, but they are not given much attention to policy and practice. So I wanted to look at those students with disabilities, because most of the practice, and even themselves sometimes find that okay, they have problems, but they come very late, especially maybe during the assessment, maybe the test or exam. With regard to how do I arrive at 6 universities? The best practice. Okay, I said that 6 universities were selected, and it's actually during the COVID-19 when the university closed for the university of the country. They are the universities which embark on, not all universities embark on online, universities embark on. Yeah. So with regard to why I call research, yes. Now I can work on some of the like conceptual problems to see how I can. Also, the student voice actually very important. Yes, yeah, we put that in.
Okay, thank you very much for your response. Getting to you better. I see your hand was up.
Yes, thanks, Judith, and thanks, Simon, for the presentation. I had a couple of questions and comments, but I think most of them have been mentioned. So one is that I think when you're bringing in issues of COVID-19 and lockdown and universities being closed, I think it would be important to reflect on how the implication of COVID-19 was in Tanzanian context, because you're talking about the Tanzanian context with the thinking that, you know, the reaction of COVID-19 in Tanzania was different compared to other countries, like let's say South Africa. So if I remember correctly, the universities were only closed for about a month or few weeks. So I think it would be interesting to reflect on that and, you know, to show how different the impact of COVID-19 was in Tanzanian context compared to other contexts. But also in your case studies, you said 6 universities. I was wondering, in these 6 universities, if the Open University is among those 6 universities, and how, and if, you know, there was any different, looking at the university that does their teaching and learning online with or without the impact of COVID-19, and also some other universities which are more like campus-based. So if you included the Open University in your case study, I think it would be interesting to see if there's any difference between these two. And lastly, I'm not sure if you're aware or if you've seen this study that was done at the University of Dar es Salaam, which speaks about the experiences or inclusion of students with visual impairment and their experience at the university. So in their finding, they stated that the students with visual impairment could learn more or less same with the students without this disability, except that the students lacked agency or, you know, knowing on how to navigate through. I mean, the implication that I got was that the supporting system was there, but these students, most of them lack agency to navigate or to look for support. So I'm not sure if you have looked at that study. If you haven't, I think it would be interesting to then bring in other data from policy or staff to see how different your study could be from this study, which only looked at students because they only did interviews from students. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Beta, for responding.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Simon. I'm going to follow up a bit on Bertha's comment about students with visual impairments, because I found myself wondering what's the difference between a student with a visual disability who perhaps then doesn't have access to braille material and so on versus those who have print disabilities. And then also thinking about, I mean, sometimes I think we assume technology is going to fix everything and do things online, then it's all good. But you were talking about published material and print material, kind of saying it's a problem that the only material or study materials that are available to students is like hard copy stuff. So I wonder, are you talking about online, you know, so if you're teaching online through e-platforms, are they then having access to
copies of the material that you're saying is problematic if they don't have the, I don't know if you get what I'm saying, the E and the hard copy stuff. So I found myself wondering if there are examples, again, of best case scenarios, universities that are managing to cater to students with print disabilities, how are they doing it? And are there examples of them doing it in low-tech ways? And that's to kind of emphasize that although technology can fix a lot, and I think Melanie mentioned pedagogy as well, there should also be other solutions that are not so tech-reliant, or expensive. So are there examples of like opportunities for students to do their exams, like oral exams or presentations, or access to audio material that doesn't necessarily need, internet and high-tech stuff for them to access? Peer support or peer support groups, that type of
Over to you with the front. Right, thank you so much for the presentation. Mine was just out of interest because in the presentation you talked about the results regarding how students with disabilities were struggling with the hard copy literature. So I'm thinking, while you're looking at e-learning, as Mikatiko said, there's some stuff that was probably sent to them through that method. And considering that if you're using computer-based kind of reading, you can always increase the font of one. Was there anything that came out speaking to which one they preferred, or was the idea of receiving stuff through e-material more enabling, or it was just as equally stumbling block as it was with the hard copy?
Any second questions?
Yeah.
Over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Simon, for a great presentation. I was just wondering on the recommendation that you give on how feasible it would be, because I'm looking at some universities that are having trouble with producing or publishing or getting books, even without looking at print disability, for instance. So in your case, in your study, do you think the recommendation that you give, I think the first and the second one, that might sound to be a bit expensive? So how feasible do you think those recommendations would be? I think the last one talked more about engaging maybe the lecturers to put in place measures that allow people that have print disabilities to be involved in the learning. The last one sounded a bit less expensive or easier to implement. I was just wondering about the first two, on your view on how you think those would actually be implemented, how feasible they are.
Yeah, I think everybody for your question and comments. Yeah, it's true that I agree with the old Professor Mikateko and Donna said anyway, is there a best practice scenario? Yes, for example, especially mentioned about the Open University. Then, right from day one, they started with online learning. So when the COVID erupts, then they proceed like there's nothing happening. But other universities which they offer the conventional way, they need actually time for them to embark on online learning. Also, after the post-COVID era, some of the programs actually decided, some of the universities, they decided to proceed because students have options. They can either go to the online learning mode, or they can go through the traditional way, or some of them, like one of the courses called postgraduate diploma in education, from School of Education, they do offer options. You can either go through online learning mode, or you can either go through traditional way. But even traditional way, you can blend. You can have like the traditional way and the modern way. So there are best practices, especially from one of the best selected Open University of Tanzania, and another University of Dar es Salaam, and so very invested about the country, where they also have those online mode, why they're offering their traditional code. With regard to the cost, I think yes, among those recommendations, okay, yes, seems like the training staff look like very cheap, but when you look from different angles, training is not cheap. So you need to like hire someone. But I think maybe I look at that to see how feasible those recommendations can be implemented with universities, especially when they are facing, because most of them, when they seek funding from the government, they're not getting what they request from the investment from the government. So they need to balance their priorities. No wonder I found that maybe these students tend to build out because the priorities they are not in terms of budget allocation, they're not given that allocation. With regard to the difference, I think difference between visual impairment, whether
Yeah, so if they provide material for students who are visually impaired, does that not in some ways already cover those who have print disabilities and all the other way around? So what would be the difference in the types of support and learning materials that need to be provided for students with visual impairments that are different to those who have print disabilities?
Okay, maybe let me answer this way, that print disability is much broader. For example, as we are wearing specs, we are facing maybe a type of print disability. But when you say visual impairment, sound like maybe at least the extent is much bigger for those students with visual disability compared to print disability. For example, I was teaching in one of the courses, and this student seems like okay until during the examination, when she was attending to exam, that's where she was struggling to do exam. And when I got her, say that okay, because I cannot see with this type, with this form. So I realized that okay, this probably is a problem for her. Actually, even herself, when she was attending lecture, she didn't see that like a problem. But until when she went for examination, then she realized that okay, I've got a problem. So we were supposed to tell her maybe she can postpone at least maybe for the next day or for the special examination so that we can accommodate her needs as a uniqueness of having the special or the font size of which sheets are vision compared to the rest of it. Yeah. With regard to, I think I mentioned some with regard to the peer support. Yes, peer support is good. I'm going to look at that. Fraser mentioned about the study conducted in Tanzania. I would love to get that copy so that I can get some maybe material from that particular publication.
Thank you very much for your response, Simon. I think this will have some more being.
Yes, as you were highlighting on the methodology, I think you mentioned that in your sample you had both private and public universities. And so I was interested to find out in your findings if at all there were any differences or common experiences and practices with regards to the students' e-learning experiences in private and private universities.
Respond or to take another question.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think I'm just building on the earlier conversations, but my interest is just to understand the nice forms of learning that we can, which forms of learning, and probably that is what I think. I'm building on actually we had conversations about various forms of learning that we are doing, and also because this time of help is key. There's one that also share issues with what's any more forms in the so I'm not sure whether you went there that look at modules of people that we are to try to change one of those.
I'm taking a family question from Christian.
Thanks for that presentation. But I'm much just want to put in the conversation under probably what the development the visual being forward. maybe do you consider or find anything around what you also something that can assist something, it keeps something things.
Okay, thank you. With regard to our public versus private, is there any difference? Yes, for example, with on the selected universities, in this particular study, we found that at least public universities, though they don't have a policy, but it took less time for them to adapt online learning. For example, I mentioned one university, for example, Open University of Tanzania, it's a public university. Right from day one, 1992, they started with actually, by that time, they were not using online, they were using the distance learning mode. But at the days called on, especially in the early 2000, they adapted the online learning. But most of private universities, most of them, they took time to adapt the online learning mode, but most of them did not have the facility in place to adapt that particular learning. The forms of e-learning, whether it's the education to visual impairment. Yeah, for example, one of the learning e-learning mode actually they use, for example, in 2 universities, I found the Judith LMS learning system in the using model. Yeah, to make sure that the students who are doing the online learning mode, they adapt. So maybe I'm going to look at their impact or the implication for the visual impaired students. And I think Chris mentioned about whether I look at the audio. Maybe I'm going to go in my.
Question. I mean, is it simply that transmission teaching gets translated into an e-form, so but with very little that's interactive or whatever? So yeah, so some sense of what are the pedagogical approaches that are used. I remember Moodle would be rather difficult to use, but not so much.
Okay, my special thanks goes to you, the same. Okay, over to you, Carmen.
Carmen, have you got a question?
Sorry, no, it was by mistake.
Okay.
Apologies for that.
We still have some more.
Yeah, I wanted other people to speak, so I thought I spoke a lot this morning, but I thought it was a really interesting presentation. But it was just to say that I had a taxi ride from the airport to here. The guy that was driving, we were having a conversation, discovered that I was education, blah blah, and he told me that he's dyslexic. And we had our daughter was dyslexic as well, so we had a very kind of interesting conversation. But so I do think I don't know kind of where dyslexia might fit into the print disability, but I think it's kind of a really important one. And he was saying that he had been stigmatized because he'd been labelled as mentally disabled because of dyslexia. And he said actually that it's on his he said he wasn't able to matriculate, it's kind of on his his reference from school and things like that. So it actually was preventing him from actually obtaining employment. So I thought it was quite interesting that so culturally, how do people understand dyslexia and the other vision impairments that you're talking about? Because in terms of the participation piece around recognition and representation, that seems quite important, kind of the cultural attitudes and things. Anyway, we then had a chat about, he was saying, oh, what advice have you got? And I thought, I don't like giving advice, but we were talking about using things like coloured overlays to make it easy to read the print and the different colours and might reflect people know we were talking about you can't get the overlays or they're too expensive, but what else we can do? So we were talking about these plastic folders and other things and using borders. We kind of went through on this journey, we kind of covered a lot of stuff. And at the end of it, he said, "Oh, do you know about the what's it called? It's called like a reading pen. So it's a reading pen where you go over the words with headphones and you can hear. And actually, my daughter has one, so she can read. You know, she's hearing what's being said with the pen. And but he said, oh, I think something like that would help me, but it costs 4,000 rand. It's just too expensive. So I think there's a thing about, certainly in England, is you tend to get very late diagnosis of dyslexia. And part of it seems to me is around resources. But actually, because once you have a diagnosis, the school has to provide support. So if you don't have a diagnosis, they don't have to provide support. So I think the resources bit seems quite important. But the other thing that you mentioned was about disclosure, and that you're finding that students are disclosing their situation quite late. I think there's lots of reasons for that might be useful to unpack. So it's partly around self-awareness, but also around stigmatization, because you know that the minute that you say that, it might be received in a particular way that could be enabling, and in a you know, we're in a capability world, it would be enabling, but actually it can actually be a barrier, because then in the way that this gentleman was stigmatized, that can happen.
So we just pull up on that because I think that's same man. And from my experience working, I think this just comes again to what Levin said about the importance of student voice, because of he was telling me all the strategies he's developed, and I saw this with him. So you want to know about, in the absence of these assistive technologies and policy, what the students are making up their own strategies to survive. I think that's really interesting.
Which also then raises questions around the Dar es Salaam paper, which you need to look at, because Bertha was saying that the students who were struggling lacked agency. But what Vanilla is saying is that that's not necessarily so. But without those stories and those voices, I think it's quite difficult.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think probably everybody who's here who wants to comment has commented. I mean, normally we would stay on, but it has been a long day and it's not over yet. And there's a light snacky lunch which is set out. So I would suggest that let's break now and have a bite to eat, have a bit of a break, and then come back at 2 for the refresh on the last 2 presentations. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Bertha.
Bye.
Bye.